In the last class, we saw how we can how we can make components in React, how we can pass data around from parent components to children component using props. Today, I want to talk about specifically about state. State is how a component can take charge of the data in its own. It doesn't need to be passed around by the parent component. It can store the data on its own and can manipulate, and the React will render it accordingly. To see what I'm talking about, let's start writing some code. This is same as making a create React app. It's just this is done in Code Sandbox, which means I can later share this whole link with you and you will have access to the whole application. Let's say we want to have a button on our main page, and I'll put a button. And let's say I also have a place where I can show count. So let me put a paragraph tag and let me put a count of 0. So now we have 0 on the screen and there is a button as well. Let me name the button as add count. And now my purpose is that whenever I click this button add count, it should increment this value. Since this app doesn't have any parent component, we are not passing around data, this component has to deal with itself how to update this value whenever this button, add count button gets pressed. The first thing we're going to do is raise this value into, let's not always have it as 0 and raise it to a variable. So I'm going to say const count is equal to 0. And then simply going to go replace 0 with the count here. Right, so it still renders the same. We just raised the hard-coded value 0 into a variable. It is still 0, and we are still rendering it below our add count button. Still, this doesn't really do anything. But now if we start thinking, we have to increment this value, this count variable, whenever this button is clicked. So maybe I can go and do an on click on this button, and I'll say on click is equal to, and again, I don't know. I'll maybe get an event, but I don't really care about the button event. So maybe it'll take some sort of a function, but again, what function, we are really not sure. Let me just uncomment this. Maybe let me just give out empty brackets again. And it still renders, right? So we have an on click, and let me just go and put a console log of count plus 1 here. Maybe this is how we could do something like that, right? Oh wow, this is going crazy. But now let's go and peep in the console what's happening. Couldn't find Istanbul reporter. Oh wow, that was a random import. When I click on add count, the button logs a value count plus 1, and it is 1. But when I click again, it is still 1. Why? Because this value count isn't really changing. Whenever we click this button, the count gets the value 0 again. This is where React's useState comes into picture. So I'm going to import something again from React, and it's called useState. What useState will give is I can say useState will give me 2 values. Let's just ignore the count for a while. useState will give me 2 values. It'll first give me state and then give me another function to set the state. And this is what useState will give me. This here syntax is for array destructuring. I think we have seen array and object destructuring a lot before, so this shouldn't be something too different. But this is important to learn that the first thing is the state. What is the state we're going to see right now? It is certain amount of a value that a component can store in itself and then have another function to manipulate that value. And that is the set state function. That we get out of calling the useState. Also, the useState can take some initial values as well. If we don't provide any initial value, it will always be null. But here we can provide an initial values that we know our count is initially 0. So I can say my initial value is 0 for the count. Our state is essentially the count, so I'm going to call it count, and the function I'm going to call setCount. It's still the same. Now I have count is equal to 0 initially because the use state is 0. If I press the button, nothing is happening till now, or just the count is getting to, we are logging the count incremented by 1, but the count always remains 0, so nothing is coming out of it. Here what we can do, instead we can use our state modifier function. This is the setState function. We have just called it as setCount. Since this is array destructuring, we can name whatever elements we come out of that array. So I'm going to use the setState and say on click, setState is equal to count plus 1. Whatever the count was, I'm just going to increment to it. And let's see how it works now. I say add count, and now it becomes 1. Why? Because this component now has an internal control of its own data using this use state. It makes the component stateful. It has some data inside of it that it can manipulate by itself and then re-render. So it's happening when let me just start refreshing again. So it's happening when I click the button. We have an initial count. Since we use state, the initial value 0 is assigned to the count for the very first time. And that's what the value we see on the screen right here. When I go and click the add count button, my button has an on click handler, which will go and add 1 to the previous count and use the state modifier function, which was setState. We have just renamed it here as setCount because it's more fitting to what our application is essentially doing. And we go and put setCount is equal to count plus 1, which will increment this count variable and add 1 more to it. And if I keep on going, I can keep incrementing the count. Similar to this, I can easily pull up a subtract count button, or let's say decrement count button. And all I have to do here is say on click the count from initial value, whatever the count was at that time, it will decrement by 1. So let me refresh. If I keep adding count, it keeps going up. And if I go on decrement count, it keeps going down. This is essentially what state is. Again, to emphasize, previously we saw a component can have data whenever it's passed by its parent component as a prop. The other way is the component can internalize the data in itself and keep it as a state. Whenever we want to use a state, we will import the useState from React. The useState function takes an initial value. If you don't provide any initial value, it's by default null. Here we are providing the initial value as 0 because we want to keep our count initially as 0. The useState function, when called, can destructure into 2 values. Again, this value is essentially state, and this value is essentially a function that will help us manipulate the state, and it's usually called a setState. We follow this pattern and we call our value count since our application is dealing with counts, and the function that manipulates the state, or essentially manipulates the count, would be called setCount.